Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first UCLA Geography Ursus Environmental Symposium, where today we're going to be looking at Ballona wetlands and the future of Southern California coastal conservation. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to a topic that for many of you probably needs no introduction at all. May I have the next slide, please? I first wanted to start by acknowledging UCLA's presence, and indeed the presence of the Ballona wetlands, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrieliano and Tongva peoples. I also wish to thank Hollis Lenderking, a UCLA class of 1971, for his incredible support of many, many programs across campus, including the Ursus Symposia. I also want to thank the UCLA Geography Department and the Ben and Gladys Thomas Air Photo Archives. There are also a number of other groups which are participating in this symposium or have communicated it, and you can see some of the icons for those groups below. I wish to thank them wholeheartedly, although I can't do it individually. May we have the next slide, please? My name's Glenn McDonald, as I said, and I'm a professor of geography at UCLA. I'm also a professor of environmental sciences and sustainability and ecology evolutionary biology. And I'm the organizer of this session, and I will be the moderator of the Q&A. I will be just giving you the briefest of introduction because we really want to hear from our panelists, our knowledgeable panelists. But let's just look at 200 years of European land use impacts on the Ballona Lagoon, and you're going to see this in more detail as we move through the symposia. Of course, we know that for over 10,000 years, the Tongva people utilized the environs of the Ballona wetlands and surrounding area as an important source of resources, important cultural site. And so we acknowledge that use. We have historical use going back to 1820 when there was a Spanish land grant and European impact began on the wetlands in the form of cattle grazing. May I have the next slide? Let's use some imagery and some historical maps to look at then quickly the evolution of the Ballona wetlands to where they are today. This is 1896. And it's a picture of duck hunting on the wetlands. And we see that already it was being impinged upon by the development of railroads, road systems and things like that. But still, much like it was with the Barrier Bar, a large wetland complex. Next slide, please. By the time we moved to 1923, and we can see from the aerial photograph and the map, we still had considerable wetland complex there. But again, development was encroaching on that, on its headwaters, and on the peripheries of the wetlands. And you can see that from the image here. Next slide, please. Now, the 1930s up to the 40s was a period of immense impacts on the wetlands. What had then been, for instance, for duck hunting and beach development, oil was discovered, and you had a lot of petroleum infrastructure, pollution, and changes. You also had flood control in the form of levees built along Ballona Creek, which then basically shot the water straight out into the Pacific Ocean. And so you can see from the image there, things had changed considerably as we moved through the 1930s and into the 1940s. And the hydrology completely changed from what the natural hydrology had been. May I have the next slide? The 1960s then saw an incredible diminishment in the area of the wetlands through the development of the Playa del Rey development, in which basically overprint Playa del Rey, Marina del Rey rather, on top of a huge area of the wetlands. Fill from the development of Marina del Rey was then placed on top of the wetlands, changing its topography. So, and of course, the hydrology was altered by the development of the Marina del Rey harbor. Just an incredible impact. Hard to imagine today that ever happening. May I have the next slide, please? So today we have basically about 577 acres of what was over 2,000 acre wetland. It has changed incredibly in terms of its hydrology, connection to the ocean, connection to fresh water. It's changed incredibly in terms of its vegetation, its topography, and its linkages to interior areas. And of course, the social setting has changed incredibly around it. That's what we're faced with today. And in a sense, that course was set in the 60s. May I have the next slide? But during the 70s, people realized the importance of wetlands. They realized the importance of green space for the citizens of LA, green space for species which we wanted to conserve. And so efforts began then to preserve the wetlands starting in the 1970s. And the efforts were focused around enhancing and restoring and creating the estuaries and associated habitat, establish natural processes and functions to support the estuarine habitats, and to develop and enhance wildlife-dependent uses and compatible on-site public uses and educational activities. This culminated then in December of 2020 with the California Department of Fisheries and Wildlife approving then a restoration project through the environmental impact reporting process. And that then has a vision, which you will see in some of the talks that we have coming up about what the Ballona wetlands could be. So that is a sort of incredible, incredible place where we find ourselves today, but it's been a very, very long trajectory of human modification of the wetlands, and then a growing awareness of the importance of this habitat and the importance of green space. May I have the next slide? Now, you'd think that this would be a win-win, that everyone would be happy about this, but there has been a lot of debate within scientific and environmental and the policy community about the right way to go about preserving and conserving the wetlands. I think we all agree they deserve conservation, preservation, but how to go about it has generated for over a decade quite a bit of debate and sometimes some very, very severe acrimonious debate. And you could see that here from articles in the LA Times, High Country News, and in even this symposium was sort of questioned and has become part of the debate over, you know, how should we manage, how should we restore or conserve the Ballona wetlands? And so I know a lot of you are here because the questions which have been raised about this debate, and we want to honestly tackle those questions as we move forward. May I have the next slide, please? This is important, not just Ballona. The only wetland we really have to preserve here in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles. We're looking at a landscape where 90% of our coastal wetlands in Southern California have been destroyed or heavily altered. What we discover at Ballona in terms of the science, the engineering, the ecology behind conservation and preservation of wetlands will be important. Equally important is what we learn about the policy, the funding, the cultural attributes of doing this. And how can we reflect the views, desires, the history of the native peoples, the indigenous peoples, who these wetlands were so important to in the past? These are all things we have to tackle, and they go far beyond Ballona. They extend to all of the wetlands in Southern California. May I have the next slide? So we have then brought together two things. One is a group of distinguished panelists, who I will introduce in a minute. And secondly, a multitude of questions which were provided by you, the audience, which have been given to the panelists to help them phrase their talks, and which we will discuss at the end of the panel presentations. So your questions and your voices are being heard and will be heard. So let me introduce the panelists so we can get to the meat of this. Our first panelist is Rich Ambrose. He's a research professor and professor emeritus of environmental health sciences and the Institute of Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. He has a decades-long history of doing research on coastal restoration and analyzing the results of coastal restoration. He has served as an advisor to many, many governmental and NGOs up and down the state of California, and brings just a wealth of experience. He will talk about some of the science behind restoration proposals for Ballona. Then we have Dave Jacobs. Dave Jacobs is a professor of ecology evolutionary biology at UCLA. He is also a member of the Institute of Environment and Sustainability. Dave takes a big, big picture approach. He looks at the evolution of the earth and the evolution of life, the co-evolution of those two things at two different landscapes. But Dave Jacobs also works on the evolution of these estuarine environments, the physics and the biology behind the California estuarine environments, and he will be talking about his perspective. He was the lead author in a 2011 SCWRP, Southern California Coastal Water Research Project publication, a technical report on all the differences, the hydrological and biological differences in these estuaries. Then we have Shelley Luce, President and Chief Executive Officer of Heal the Bay. For far over a decade, she has been involved with Heal the Bay, and before that, with attempts to plan and put together a restoration for the Ballona wetlands. She brings us a wealth of experience as a scientist, but also as a person deeply embedded in the policy world. And finally, to give us the big picture, we have David McNeil. He's the executive officer of the Baldwin Hills Conservancy. His passion has been working to see how green spaces, urban wildlands, can be preserved through a deep understanding of real estate, deep understanding of communications, and a deep understanding of administration. But he also is passionate about the use of these urban wild spaces and green spaces for the diverse communities of Los Angeles, to connect the spaces together, but also to connect them with people and reflect the diversity of our population. And he'll be talking about that from that sort of 30,000 foot perspective. So without further ado, I would like then to begin with our panelists. And the first panelist would be Rich Ambrose.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. Let me see, I will hopefully share the right screen here. And how about now?
We're seeing you. Oh, there we are, Rich. Thank you.
Okay, good. So that was my title slide there. So yes, as Glenn mentions, I have 30 years of experience with coastal wetland restoration projects throughout Southern California. Here's a list of the projects I've been an advisor on or been involved in. And so what my goal today is to give you sort of a broad perspective of the science that goes behind and the thinking that goes behind wetland restoration planning, and then to apply that to Ballona. At Ballona, I co-chaired with Eric Stein a wetland restoration science advisory committee put together by the California Coastal Conservancy, and Shelley Luce was also a member of that advisory committee. I've gotten involved with wetland restorations from all sorts of different types of wetlands, from really small intermittently open systems to large fully tidal systems. A few things have really changed over the last 30 years. So some of the basic procedures are more or less the same, but we've learned quite a bit. And so, for example, 30 years ago, nobody ever thought about sea level rise when they were restoring wetlands, because that just was not on the horizon. But now every wetland restoration project considers how sea level rise is likely to influence it. And we also now have a much better understanding about historical wetland conditions, including wetland losses. When we think about planning a wetland restoration, there's a few main considerations that are important in deciding what kind of wetland we want to produce. The most important really is to establish the goals and objectives. And so early on, when wetland restoration was first being done, it really suffered from a lack of clearly specified explicit goals and objectives. And so, you know, it didn't necessarily do what people wanted it to do. And it was also very hard to assess whether the wetland restoration was successful or not, because you really weren't sure what it was supposed to accomplish. And so this ends up being sort of the core for determining what the restoration plan is like. A few things go into the goals and objectives. And so clearly the project sponsor has some ideas and scientists will have some ideas, but a big part is understanding the site opportunities and constraints. I'm going to talk a little bit about that for Ballona. But also it's useful to have a regional perspective and a historical perspective. And I will talk also a little bit about those. And these are things that we actually have a much better handle on now than we did a decade or two ago. A second main consideration is sustainability. The goal really is to have a restoration project that can sustain itself with minimal maintenance and, you know, external human input. And so to do that, we often focus on processes that are needed for the sustainability rather than just like a structure. And now, as I mentioned, we need to worry about sea level rise. And I probably won't have time at the end, but I'm prepared to talk about sea level rise in the questions if we have any questions about that. So I mentioned we have a better regional perspective now. For years, Southern California wetland ecologists wanted to understand what had happened, what was going on, what the status of wetlands in Southern California was, and what had happened in the past. And a few years ago, the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project produced this regional strategy update that did a really nice job of pulling together a lot of that information. And one of the reasons this is important is it means that now we can look at each individual restoration site. We can look for opportunities to restore habitats that had the biggest regional losses. And so we can try to as much as possible, get back the types of habitats we've lost in the region rather than just paying attention to an individual site. However, we need to understand that there's going to be local constraints, and we have to know what the project goals are to make sure that it's consistent with those things. So here's an example of the kind of information we now have. This is a regional study looking at the topographic sheets that have been produced in the mid-19th century, 1850 to 1870s or so. And this comes from a report from Eric Stein and co-authors, where we can look at how much wetland did we have in Southern California in about the mid-19th century, and then how's that compared to what we have now. And in the top, we see for all of Southern California, we had in blue, we have how much subtidal there was. In green, we have the estuarine vegetated wetland. And in tan, we have the estuarine unvegetated wetland. And you can see that from 1850 to 2005, tremendous losses in vegetated wetland and in unvegetated wetland, a little bit of an increase in subtidal, and that's really ports and marinas. Down below, we see what we had in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles County area. Less subtidal than the region as a whole. Large amounts of vegetated wetland and unvegetated wetland, and an even more dramatic decline. We now have only about 4% of the vegetated and unvegetated wetlands that we had in 1850 or so. So that information, as I mentioned, comes from an analysis of these T-sheets across all of Southern California, which is one of the first sort of good overviews that we have of what the wetlands were like. And I know Dave Jacobs is going to talk much more about that. We also have a historical study, a historical ecology study here at Ballona Creek Wetland. And these are really important because they give us an opportunity to guide the restoration of a specific site, knowing what had been there. So we can look for opportunities to restore the habitats that used to occur at a site, and it also can provide insights into the processes needed for sustainable habitats. But just like with the regional strategy, we have to recognize that there are going to be local constraints, and we need to make sure that the restoration plan is consistent with the project goals. So here is just an example of what that looks like for Ballona. I know many of you have probably seen this. Inset up here is the T-sheet that's been colored to indicate the different kinds of habitats. This T-sheet was done in 1876. And before the T-sheet, of course, if we go back before 1825, the LA River actually drained through Ballona. And then from the T-sheet, we have what the wetland was like when the river had changed course and drained into south of Palos Verdes. And at that point, the wetland was only open to the ocean after significant rainfall, and it was dominated by freshwater inputs. But if we look at the main picture, we see that historical wetland overlaid on our current conditions, and we can see that we've got Marina del Rey and Ballona Creek channels existing, and those require a constant connection to the ocean. So really, there's not really a feasible way to restore to historical conditions here. And even if we did, we'd have to ask, do we want to restore it to before or after 1825? Because those wetlands, one with the LA River with massive flows and scour, would be a completely different wetland than the wetland that happened when the river was draining to a different area. So the Science Advisory Committee did a much more detailed look at opportunities and constraints at Ballona, but here's just my high level overview. I mean, the opportunities is Ballona is adjacent to an ocean, so we have easy access to tidal flow. And we can get fresh water, we can get riparian and fresh water in other places away from the ocean, but the only place we can get tidal flow is next to the ocean. So that's an opportunity we have at Ballona that we don't have in other places. And also, although it's only a small fraction of the area it used to be, there's sufficient area to support a variety of different habitat types. And that's definitely an opportunity we have at Ballona that we don't always have. The constraints include the fact that it's a highly altered landscape. So I mentioned we have Marina del Rey adjacent to it, and the mouth of the marina has to be open. The boats would not be happy if they were stuck in or out of the marina. Ballona Creek now drains a large urban watershed. The creek drains a much bigger area than it did historically, and it's been channelized and it's largely impervious surface. And so there's a hydrology there that did not exist historically, and that's a major constraint. And then we also have existing infrastructure, not all of which is at a high enough elevation to exist with full tidal flow. So the Ballona Wetland Science Advisory Committee took this kind of information and other discussions and public meetings and things into account and came up with this overall goal for the project. And I wanted to emphasize here that this is a focus on ecosystem restoration. So the committee decided that rather than try to focus on individual species and design a restoration to support specific species, that we would focus on the whole ecosystem. And so the overall goal is to restore, enhance, and create estuarine habitat and processes in the Ballona ecosystem to support a natural range of habitats and functions, especially as related to estuarine-dependent plants and animals. And then there are these sub-goals down below. I don't have time to talk about them, but they are in support of this overall goal. And the committee decided that these goals and objectives could best be met by maximizing the area of estuarine habitat, restoring large, contiguous, and diverse estuarine wetlands, restoring fully tidal wetlands, again, because of the opportunity of being close to the ocean, by removing or breaching levees to the extent possible, maximizing hydrologic connectivities within the different sub-areas, and incorporating adaptive management measures into any restoration alternative. And so I know I'm out of time, and so I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk about sea level rise later if we have a chance.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. And I'd like to then call on David Jacobs to share his scientific viewpoints with us.
Yeah, so I'm just going to be looking into the, starting from the past and process and trying to see if we can inform what's going on in Ballona a little bit. In this image, we're in Del Rey, looking, inland, 120 years ago or so, and you can see it's a very different world. And this is again at the edge of this largely freshwater lake. So, what I'm going to talk about is that California estuaries are historically they close and perch above high tide. This is important because the water levels are intermittently quite high. And the people don't like that. They actually don't like having the landscape flooded, so they've eliminated that. And secondly, this also means that the landscape itself is often higher than you expect. A lot of the surfaces in and around Marina, the Ballona area are actually near original grade in some cases because, in fact, the landscape was perched up by the closure of the system. I'd also like to talk a little bit about, how other restorations and processes suggest problems and solutions for what might be going on at Ballona. And I would also suggest that, we need an active and responsive management to the unpredictability of the situation, and in particular these two problems that flood tide deltas will build in if we don't have the right structure in that first flush and so forth. Contaminants, we don't want those going directly into our restoration. So first of all, I'd just like to address this question of how closed is closed. Estuaries on California are actually mainly lagoons. That is, they close up most of the time, and this is true to a large degree. But in fact, things can close at various elevations. And here's just a scale at which things can close. A couple of important things to note are you can have dunes impounding things, you can have beach berms impounding things, and so you have places like the Santa Ynez River on the bottom there, which is probably much like what Bayona would have been like in the past, a large flooded landscape behind a beach berm, or perhaps in the case of Oso Flaco with dunes. So these things are important in terms of making a hinterland that's actually intermittently flooded as water comes down in the rainy season. Water goes up, and it doesn't always breach right away. So you have lots of flooding in of the landscapes. And one of the things we can do is just go and both look at modern and such as those images and historic data, and use that categorization to look at things. Here's an area near Carpinteria in Santa Barbara County, a couple of malls there, one of which we can see in the T-sheet. You can see where low tide is. We can categorize this as open in this image at a 3. Not that it was always open that way, in fact, but that's how it was mapped in 1869. We can see the adjacent Carpinteria Creek as perched. That is, it has sand and high and low tide going across the mouth, and it would perch up. One interesting thing about this area is, so we can quantify these things. We can quantify them from the whole state or from the area south of the Bay Bridge. And we can see that, perched systems are really the norm. Closed and dune dammed and perched systems are the modality. There are very few open systems that had significant tide. There are some, but they're very few in number. Some of them are larger, but nevertheless, that's not the typical setting that you have for coastal wetlands in California. If we go back to this area, we can see this a line here. The other thing that has happened dramatically, water used to be able to get around the landscape. Here we can see flow between these two systems was permitted through this area behind the dune line. Well, that doesn't happen anymore, right? Here's the same line, and this is obviously developed, and it's gated out. So there's a tide gate over on the left here, and so forth, so that water doesn't get into this subdivision anymore, as it might have in the past. So the landscape is now much more, confined to be non-migratory, not dynamic, locally stable in a manufactured way. So this is universally true. If you go to, say, Santa Barbara, we can see there's a 1.5 kilometer long lagoonal wetland feature there, and you might be you may have missed it because it was gone by 1870, right? So this has already been gated out and made it into ag land and then into urban area, and now part of it is the sewage treatment plant, et cetera. So these things, these landscapes that were wetted and perched up and flooded intermittently are now largely gone from Southern California. Well, if we turn to Bayona, we can see that this is also the case. So people started actually managing Bayona to protect property before the T-sheets were made. This is a document from the LA Star in 1872 discussing how this Mr. Tell here was protecting property from flooding in Bayona by digging a ditch and draining it. And so these things are all happening before the T-sheets were made in 1876. So by the time we're looking at the T-sheets in Bayona, we're already, because in part the T-sheets are relatively late because it was not as economically interesting as, say, San Diego or Santa Barbara. We have a somewhat already altered view where we have a system that people have been manipulating. And obviously, as discussed before, we get a nice, or perhaps not so nice, drainage ditch in the 1930s. But at that time, it's recognized that that is the first introduction to a tidal estuary to the region, right? So that's when you first get a tidal system as recognized at the time by people working on, by those recording the events in the past. It's important to realize that a lot of estuarine construction has had interesting properties. Here's Bolsa Chica. This is a restoration, and it looks a lot like a harbor. It was built to mitigate for a port. And you can see there's a lot of, one of the major issues that happens when you reduce when you have tidal systems. You reduce the water table, you wind up desiccating the hinterland and getting rid of riparian and freshwater contacts a lot. So these are all kinds of things that one has to be concerned about relative to how one does restoration. That tidal, making something tidal or maintaining a tidal actually has negative impacts on the freshwater fauna, the riparian fauna, and the intermittently fresh landscape around a system. And this is important because if we consider the region, we have a large number of endangered species. A very significant fraction of those are associated with this loss of this intermittently wetted, flooded landscape that used to be pervasive in the lowlands of LA and Ventura, and to a certain extent, Santa Barbara County and some other areas as well. And so we have, lots of things, a lot of them amphibians and reptiles and clapper rails and things like that seem to have preferred these kinds of intermittently wetted settings. So that's something to bear in mind. Another point to make here is that you can have situations where people decide to open up things to the ocean or for restoration. Here's Bataquitos. This is a restoration that was conducted down in northern San Diego County. And the consequence of actually jetting this open are to not only have, to have a tidal system, which was once a closing system, nearly always closed, but obviously intermittently open. But what we can see here is we have a constrained mouth, and the dramatic flow in and constraint of that flow in the channel into the system drags the beach sand in. In other words, there's enough velocity and inertia that's developed in here that you have a jet that goes out into the lagoon, and then it slows and it drops its sediment load. So we have erosion or high flows underneath these in these narrow passages, and then we have deposition in adjacent areas. And if you look at imagery, you can see there's often a dredge operating here. So this is not really a sustainable situation in the sense that you have to continually have inputs through dredging, which is an important consideration in these sort of in the balance sheet of these things, both ecologically and financially. So yeah, turning back to Bayona, people tried to open it a number of times before that nice drainage ditch was built in the 1930s. So earlier opening attempts led to tidal flow. And so they succeeded in that to that extent, but they succeeded enough to actually develop flood tide deltas. So in fact, in every stage of the evolution of Bayona, you can see that the landscape, and in many of these other systems, when you open them, you wind up with flood tide deltas building in them, and that's into them. And that's actually the first effective step in the closure process, is to begin to occlude the mouth in that fashion. So these are the things that are likely to go on if you have restorations that have a narrow mouth and that open up inland. So if we had a restoration with a plan, something like this, we would see that we could expect these areas to develop flood tide deltas and then have the whole thing evolve away from the design very rapidly, much as has happened in Bataquitos. So this is the kind of thing that must be kept in mind as, or that these other things, these other experiments that were done or other restorations done elsewhere lead us to think that you should keep in mind. And part of the problem is then if you have high flows coming down intermittently down the drainage here, it's very hard to predict what the landscape will look like. And that's one significant problem. Another aspect to think about is that this area now has a huge amount of anomalously tidal features in it already. So it's not exactly clear that we want to accentuate more tide in this area. But and one of the other problems that we need to confront is this, that we have this highly urbanized drainage. And so this is one of the most, when it first rains here, you get a very toxic water coming in, very nutrient rich. And that's not necessarily what you want to have going into your wetland, and at least at first. And so there are probably ways to deal with this. So one of the things to point out is that having this drainage ditch, sure, it's a drainage ditch, but it also concentrates flow in this regular width feature, such that scour, when you do have high flows, can eliminate material, etc., and if you manage to isolate or keep isolated during the initial first flush, the rest of the wetland, then you can actually bypass the initial contamination phase as well, but then take advantage of pressure waters during those times when you don't have as the water is cleaner. So one can imagine doing this in various ways. What I'd like to suggest is that you could have gates that are smart. That is, you can open and close them, and so you can adapt them to what might happen through time, whether it be sea level rise or changing conditions or decisions about the priority needs of certain species, etc. So you could begin to have a set of thoughts about these things and be able to manage them effectively at reasonable cost without having to redo the restoration every time something happened or dredge it out or what have you. And you could, if you wanted to, have additional gates in new places, not just at the previous existing constraining points on the landscape, if that was desired, but one perhaps shouldn't get too carried away. And then you could have various sorts of management that was specific to the endangered species on the landscape. This would, of course, be a good thing, even though that's not something that has been called for in previous restoration, because you don't want to fail by not actually succeeding in getting that endangered species to survive. So yeah, so in those notes, I just like to sort of emphasize, these are the points I was making, that we have a landscape that was large amounts of this lowland landscape were underwater much of the time, or well, that not necessarily much of the time, but were inundated with some frequency, and that the loss of and opening up of these systems leads to extirpation and endangerment of a lot of species and desiccation and saltwater intrusion. And lastly, that there may be ways to restore such that you avoid some of the risks that are apparent in other restorations, such as flood tide deltas, and that you can perhaps conceive of ways to manage the contaminant load from the urbanized watershed, and also have some ways to deal with the unpredictability of the situation. We don't really know how this is all going to unfold, and so we need to have a more active management to efficiently resurrect these intermittent processes and landscapes, and manage them in some sensible way as our perspectives on these things inevitably change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was excellent. And we'll now look at where we are with the current plans in the EIR. And so I'd like to ask Shelley Luce to then please speak to with us.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And thank you, UCLA, for the opportunity to speak today about Ballona wetlands restoration. I am going to talk about the alternatives that are examined in the EIR with a focus on the preferred alternative of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and a little bit about what that will accomplish and how it might be implemented, and then also talk about some of the other alternatives as well. So I'm going to share my screen and jump right in. I hope. There we go. So this is a map of the Ballona Wetlands Ecological Reserve, which is its official name today, approximately today. And we've already talked a little bit about the constraints, so I won't name them all, but I do just want to locate it here with the Marina del Rey right here, one of the largest recreational marinas in the world. The different areas, as we refer to them, A, B, and C. And then over here, the community of Playa Vista, and up here, the bluffs along here. These are the Westchester Bluffs. So this is the area that we're working with. This is a timeline, and I think it's important to look at the timeline because it really shows we've taken quite a while to get here. And this starts in 2003. So it's kind of in the middle of the modern story of Ballona, because there were decades of discussion and fighting about what to do with the whole remaining wetlands, including what is now Playa Vista, for some time. But the story we're talking about today starts in 2003, when the land was acquired by the state and given to the Department of Fish and Wildlife to manage. Within a year, they began public stakeholder meetings about how to restore this land. In 2005, it was designated an ecological reserve. And in 2006, we began the Scientific Advisory Committee meetings that Rich referred to. We had about 7 of them occurring over several years. In 2010, we started baseline data collection. Now, there were studies before then. Certainly different parts of the wetlands were examined, measured different things in different areas, but there had not been comprehensive surveys of ecological condition, kind of lot line to lot line, until this 2010 surveys began. And then they were conducted annually for at least 5 years. A big 5-year report was published, and they've been conducted periodically since then. And that's where we got the first picture of the condition of areas A, B, and C all together as a whole. What's really out there? What can we measure scientifically and repeatedly to say how well this population is doing, how well that population is doing? I think that's really important because it is what informs the development of the environmental impact report and the design of the restoration. One of the major things that informs those things. So using that information, the Department of Fish and Wildlife wrote the EIR and released a draft in 2017. There was, I think it's about 1,200 pages long, and generated a lot of comments from the public, which is wonderful. The department responded to those comments, released a final EIR in 2019, and then at the very end of 2020, they certified their EIR and designated alternative 1, as it's called, as the preferred alternative. And so now, 2020 going forward, we're in the permitting phase. And one really important thing to remember is that an EIR is a document that is at about 30% design. So it's a gross level design. This is not fine details at this point. We'll talk more about that later. I know we talked about Ballona, the history of Ballona geologically, but I wanted to show this just to remind everybody what we're talking about here. Ballona Creek / LA River. Sometimes the LA River flowed out here with Ballona Creek. And then over time, it changed significantly. About 500 years ago, you see this very complex freshwater and closed lagoon system, or partially open lagoon system. 1900, we start to see some development, some closing off of natural waterways. In 1930, it looks quite different. Ballona Creek's a lot straighter there. 1965, straight as an arrow right out to the ocean, and we have Marina del Rey. And then approximately today, this is what we're dealing with. And the green here on this map is the ecological reserve that Fish and Wildlife now manages and has the option to restore. I also want to point out one of the major results of the scientific surveys, the comprehensive surveys that were carried out. We found that we are seeing a rapid degradation in habitat over time at the Ballona wetlands as we continue to do nothing for restoration, or very little for restoration. So here, non-native plant cover or invasive plant species, some non-native, some of which are invasive, is between 10 and 40%, that's the bright yellow, on most of the wetlands and most of the reserve. And in 2013, 6 years later, that's gone way up. So it's more like 60 to 100%. And there are many, many areas where we see just a monoculture of invasive plants like crown daisy and, the bright yellow one, mustard, and others. So the restoration project is underway as far as the design, and it has 2 major goals the way that I talk about it. One is ecosystem restoration, and we want to restore, enhance, and create estuarine habitat and support a range of different habitats on this nearly 600-acre parcel. And goal number 2 is a socioeconomic value. There are aesthetic and cultural needs. There are research and education uses. And very important from a social justice aspect is the increased public access and recreational use of this very large publicly owned parcel. We also talk about restoration as an umbrella term, which can include enhancement, rehabilitation, or creation, because what we're really restoring are ecological functions, the natural infrastructure that serves human beings and other creatures on this planet. So restoring processes and functions was paramount for this design. Not choosing a specific point in time was chosen as the best path, in part because we don't know which point in time was best, and in part because we're at this point in time with levees and recreational boating marinas and entire communities now sitting on what used to be a variety of wetland and riverine systems. We also want to consider those current constraints and future conditions. And as Rich mentioned, this was kind of new at the time. I think we were one of the first wetlands restoration plans to specifically look at sea level rise predictions in particular years in the future and what a given design would look like once sea level reached that point. There were 4 alternatives examined in the draft EIR. Alternative 1, we call the naturalized creek or full tidal restoration. And this is the artist rendering of it. And you can see that what was, I think I said straight as an arrow between Lincoln Boulevard and Marina del Rey is a curving stream here. And there's another one off to the right, a tidal channel. Alternative 2, I'll show in a minute. It's a partial naturalized creek or a restored partial sinuous creek is what the EIR calls it. It's basically phase 1 of this first alternative, but we just don't do phase 2. Alternative 3 is an oxbow, and alternative 4 is no project. So I'll just go straight to those alternatives so people can see what I'm talking about. This is a garishly colored diagram of alternative 1. So the colors do not necessarily relate to the types of habitat here. And that's why I like to show the artist rendering first, because it's more like what we will actually see when this is completed. But you can see that we have taken out the concrete or gunite levees between Lincoln Boulevard and the Marina del Rey channel and created a curving stream, a meandering stream, more like what a real or a natural creek would have looked like. Also allowing or acknowledging that tidal channels will form off of that creek on both sides of it. The yellow areas are upland, and upland areas are very important to wetlands. There's a lot of interaction, and because sea level is going to rise, we need upland areas so that some of our wetland areas will eventually be able to migrate there. We leave the levees in the creek east of Lincoln Boulevard. You can see area C, there's a black blob there. Those are Little League baseball fields. So we leave the levees in there and we restore upland habitat so that it is native vegetation, providing a diverse and robust habitat for lots of different animals. There's also a little stream there, it looks like, in the north half of Area C, that's riparian. And that would be a very nice way to include dynamic freshwater habitat that could be restored as a freshwater riparian area. In what was Area A, where the curving creek is, we see also around the edges transition zone, which is the darker brown, and then upland, which is the yellow. In the transition zone and upland, there are salt pan areas and also a little bit of brackish there, which is purplish. And then finally, down in the left-hand corner, it says West Area B. There's a salt marsh there that's protected by upland. You can see that yellow ring around it is high land, it's upland, to help preserve that salt marsh. And there's also green to the left of that, which will be tidal salt marsh, and we'll have a creek opened up through there. The purple bow tie things are culverts. So we're still gonna have managed areas. That's what that diagonal cross hatching south of Culver Boulevard represents. It says Southeast Area B, South Area A. That's area that we call managed because it's still subject to gates and culverts and water getting in and out there. So that's a quick overview of alternative A. Even quicker overview of alternative B. You can see it's very similar. The difference is in the lower left-hand corner, where we leave the tide gates in place, those little bow ties right along the bottom edge of the creek channel there means that West Area B would continue to be managed so that it only has a little bit of tidal flow, muted tidal flow. You don't get the very high tides there, very low tides. And those tide gates currently cause a muted tidal range there. So those would stay in place, and all the restoration would really be inland of this point here, but otherwise the same as alternative one. And alternative one actually would be conducted in 2 phases. And this would be the first major phase. And we could stop here and just call this the restoration if we chose to. If we go on to phase 2, then that's the full alternative one restoration. And finally, alternative 3 is called, I call it the Oxbow alternative. And this leaves the entire channel in place. And it shows that we could have some tide gates on the north bank of Ballona Creek, which is now in this alternative continues to be concrete or gunite hardened. And some tide gates would allow a little natural stream, just a little C shape there. And then some similar habitats to what we showed in the previous 2, but it leaves everything south of the creek channel as is, highly managed and dependent on existing tide gates. So that's the overview of the 3. And I'm going to focus on alternative 1 because that is the preferred alternative of Fish and Wildlife. And the main reasons for their preference is that it creates the most possible wetlands, restores, enhances the most possible area, greatest possible area of wetlands. It increases public access as much as possible, much more than the other alternatives. It is the most resilient to sea level rise. And this is something that is difficult to understand and is controversial and is not perfect, like anything we're trying to do to combat sea level rise impacts. But this alternative is the one that allows the most sea level rise and the most habitat to coexist going forward. We expect phase 1 would take about 5 years to implement. Then we would pause, meet some goals, and if those goals are met, move on to phase 2, which would take another 3 years to implement. So what alternative 1 does is it removes all of the invasive plants and adds native plants. And this is really important if we want to have native animals and if we want to have strong, robust populations of native animals, because what we have right now is some natives, in my layperson's terms, hanging on by a thread, trying desperately to survive in this extremely urbanized and impacted area that could be doing much better and be much more robust populations, much more resilient themselves if they had the diverse habitat with which they evolved. So increasing habitat for native species to forage and breed and everything else. Improving habitat, especially for sensitive wetland species. And overall, of course, improving biodiversity. It reconnects a natural hydrology, reconnecting creeks, rivers, and estuaries with floodplains. This is something that is inherently more sustainable over time, even with sea level rise, if it's designed properly and if we have the room for things to migrate. It increases tidal flushing and it creates nurseries for fish that rely on estuary nurseries. And it also allows for significant freshwater influence, especially during heavy rains. And you can see that on the maps in the EIR. Alternative 1 would require the use of heavy machinery because we would be removing fill that was placed there over decades in order to recreate the tidal movement and the stream system that was once there. And this slide is in here. I included in here, it's not necessary for scientific discussion of the wetlands, but I include it because I think wetlands restoration is a bit of a mystery to a lot of people. I participated very, very closely in the Malibu Lagoon restoration. And so this person walking in front of the bulldozer where it says biologist monitoring heavy machinery, I saw people doing that, and they were flushing animals out of the way, collecting animals and holding on to them until it was safe to release them, things like that. And so these are techniques that were used in other restoration projects, Malibu, Bolsa Chica, Madrona, Carpinteria, others that we can talk about. I'm not going to talk a lot about public access because Dave is an expert in that and he's going to speak next, but it's detailed in the EIR. And if you compare what's there today, which is nothing or a very little bit in one corner where the want to visit, even where the friends are, you get out of your car in a rutted and flooded dirt parking lot and try to make your way to a path, it's not very conducive that SoCalGas has for monitoring gas on the wetlands and taking it all off of public land, and having SoCalGas monitor their wells from their own land, which allows us to restore that public land to something natural and sustainable. And I want to spend just a minute talking about sea level rise, but I'm going to check my time first. Oh, thank you. So I'm going to talk about sea level rise for just a moment here. We looked all the way to 2100 and we estimated 59 inches, which was the best estimate at the time and is the worst case scenario, or at least was the worst case scenario predicted at that time. And you can see that a lot of what we start out with here, green, high, mid, and low marsh becomes red in 2100, which is mudflat. Mudflat is still good habitat. It's still important. We are expecting that low to mid marsh to migrate into what starts out as upland. And we are expecting even the managed wetland to turn a little bit more into mudflat. Now, this again is the worst case scenario. There could be less sea level rise than that. There could also be different adaptations put in place during the restoration or after the restoration. So this is kind of the baseline scenario for sea level rise. And I think I need to wrap up my presentation, so I'm going to end it there. Thank you, Glenn.
Well, thank you very much, Shelley. You packed a lot of information into your talk. We're now going to hear, as Shelley alluded to Dave McNeil, who's going to take us to a sort of larger view picture, but also look at how we then we have access to this and equality. So Dave, I'm going to hand this over to you now.
All right. I think my audio is on, and I'm glad to be here today. I have to take a pause for a moment and, just my heart goes out to the people in Minneapolis, Brooklyn Center. The issues that we're dealing with in this country are tearing us all apart. We are in a situation where racial justice is important, as well as environmental justice, which we'll try and get to, and socioeconomics are dictating all of it. And it's all, to me, relates to human rights. So I just wanted to take a minute to recognize, we're in this big experiment that we call, social systems. The Chumash, Tongva, these regions of coastal California were thriving with villages at one time, as we've seen, and the native people were the stewards that lived in nature, thrived in nature, and truly had the best access to the greatest show on earth. We've learned a lot about the Ballona wetlands today. The main takeaway I have is that we really want to make sure that equitable access is part of what we do, allowing people to nurture the nature, understand the biodiversity, and all of that without creating conflict. I'm showcasing the Baldwin Hills here, certainly a large area, the last space in the watershed. Upland from the Ballona Creek and the Ballona wetlands. It's important when I look at the Baldwin Hills, we're a part of the Natural Resources Agency, but we haven't always been a part of the state's focus. And it's a beautiful thing. And full disclosure, I work for the Natural Resources Agency and I'm not a scientist. I am gonna try and pretend like a social scientist here on screen. But long and short, the Conservancy has been working in this area for a while now. And we've been doing a lot of collaborative work to make sure that the non-governmental agencies, as well as the community groups and the political support and economic opportunities are all trying to move this agency forward. And this predates, this postdates the 1980s when the park was established. So I can just put into perspective that 20 years ago in 1980, they wanted to build a park. 20 years later, they started a Conservancy. 20 years after that, I'm here trying to make this dream come true. So we see public work projects, even if they're good for the public good and the right thing to do, take a long time. And there's always controversy involved in it. We went through a planning process for a number of years, and we were the only agency to approve it. Local counties didn't want to approve it, but it was the Baldwin Hills Park Master Plan. And it's a vision. It's a vision for, 2 square miles of open space, 1/3 natural, 1/3 cultural, 1/3 active. And, when you have these discussions about what should be there, some people want all soccer fields, some people want all preserves, some people want all cultural facilities to have it to be this icon in LA, in Black LA. All of their needs cannot be met. And so we have to compromise. I can't talk about anything other than, without bringing up the pandemic and what it's meant to Los Angeles in terms of the impacts. Certainly the pandemic that we've learned that in too many communities of color that open space access wasn't necessarily a right. It wasn't a privilege, it was a right that should be a right. We know that parks are proving to be an essential part of how communities of colors cope with crises. And park systems are essentially infrastructure and have the potential to be resilience hubs to further benefit communities. And that need issue, and once again, it goes back to our social systems and how I believe, I'm looking at how they're broken and they need fixing. We've looked at the situation in the county with regards to recreation needs. We've seen the lack of open space and the high density in the areas east of Baldwin Hills, south of Baldwin Hills. And this is the high density area as well. I mean, God knows the marina has been built layer upon layer upon layer. This is not an economic need. This is a density open space need. So that's the bridge. We both have high end and socioeconomic that need something in this area to go to. We did a study in 2017 in and around the Baldwin Hills, and this little indicator in this circle is the Baldwin Hills kind of area. And we saw that East LA, South LA, all were drawn to the Baldwin Hills essentially as their heat map to go to for open space. It's kind of important to think about people are willing to travel, different zip codes a mile away to get out open space. And, with the high demand, it's kind of interesting to know that the lower income communities would benefit the most from improved access, especially activities that gives them a chance to have cleaner air on the coast. I know that the air is cleaner than it is anywhere else in Los Angeles, as well as a place to have activity, whether it's biking or walking or jogging or just strolling, just getting off that couch and being able to do something. It's just really important to know that 41% of lower income households in Los Angeles do not have immediate access to a park. And, this access conversation is so big that, I haven't really talked about. I'm going to link all these together, but at the beginning, I definitely also wanted to recognize that, the ADA access issue from parklands everywhere else, the buses everywhere else I'm not addressing it today. It's a part of the social system that needs to be dealt with. The special needs. I have a friend who has moved into my neighborhood and he's asking where he can take his, 10 to 11-year-old daughter who has special needs, and because they age out of the smaller systems. That's an inclusive voice that needs to be heard. I'm not going to speak directly to that here, but I'm just saying there's a whole bunch left on the table that there maybe should be a whole nother forum that Glenn could put together on that kind of access. We connect open space. The eastern area from Crenshaw, across Baldwin Hills, out to Ballona and the wetlands. That's the connectivity. That's the regional opportunity we have here in the area. We've done some work along the Ballona Creek. We've got the only green street down here along the creek in a little pocket park that connects LAUSD schools. As good as they might be, there's a lot of them that are struggling. And Maria Del Rey Middle School is a great school. They're a great principal, but they definitely have Black and brown students that now have access to cross the street and have access to things that you see in other places. And it's unique to this area. And we're very proud of that work. I also want to say along the way, we have our constituents and our friends at Mar Vista Gardens. The Conservancy has been privileged to work with Konkui Design Initiative and the Boys and Girls Club on trying to allow better access. It's a community of long-term multi-generational, multilingual residents, and it's an opportunity to enhance open spaces and provide ecological, social, and educational benefits to local residents. And I'm grateful to the beginnings of a bilingual planning process to link the community to the Ballona Creek, obviously going out this way west, and the confluence is here, and this heads out to the ocean where that fresh air is in this one housing development that's in the west side. It's the only one here, and they're engaged in the process. We're empowering them, I believe. You know, we're talking about the next generation of stewards. The Baldwin Hills has got some great work with LA Audubon Society and others that have managed to help empower our youth. And we're really talking about the next generation that's going to take my job and all the rest of our jobs. Our work with them has been fantastic at LA Unified School District, as well as West LA College Connection and Stewardship. Some of these pictures are old, and these people are leaders. They have jobs in the industry, and they're doing great things. I look at this as an alternative. Educating these children, meeting them where they are, and allowing them to have walking access to learn and education about nature as an alternative to ending up with a misdemeanor that gets you pulled over on the freeway and shot. It's just, you know, this is the opportunity we have to save one or two people and build a bridge for those people to enter into this industry and have healthy, thriving lives. At risk is I think the thing that reminds me that, you know, we have a lot of youth at risk, and this is an opportunity to open their eyes to things that they don't see and provide them access. Jobs, you know, that's where the money bottom line comes down. I shared this study from El Zelfier, I can't even, it's probably French, but it's a marine policy paper. And they talked about the American Recovery Act and how it brought jobs in the environmental industry, in restoring coastal habitat and green infrastructure and green job creation. Bottom line, you know, 17 jobs per million people per $1 million spent. 17 jobs per $1 million spent is a lot. And if they spend a lot of money doing work in restoration anywhere in the watershed, be it Baldwin Hills, Ballona Creek, or the wetlands, there's an opportunity to have economic development, which is opportunity to keep people out of trouble and off the streets and engaged in the economy in a positive way. Let's see where we're at here. I'm trying to get through this. The governors did take a leadership role in the executive order in 982-20. That was last year. It's a good beacon to say, hey, we need to think about communities of color. We need to think about environmental justice. We have been beneficiaries of working with Slate C, and they are an environmental justice organization, and they really have an empowerment zone that includes this blacked out square area along mid-city, a lot of wonderful communities, Florence, Exposition Park, Vermont Square. But we've asked them to expand their boundary, the dotted line, to work on our climate resiliency hub project in the Baldwin Hills. This is going to create a lot of zip codes, a better understanding of the challenges that we're facing in terms of the heat island effect that takes place, and understanding why we're doing foresting and greenways. And speaking of greenways, you know, we're connecting the Baldwin Hills by the Rail to River project, another big idea, unfunded. We have a lot of unfunded big ideas. That's kind of, but you got to dream. And you throw your hat over the wall and you figure out how to line up the political, the people, the constituents, and the money at the same time. And that's what happens over 40 years, maybe sometimes, depending upon what you do. And you still have the work to do. That being said, east to west, Valley River through Slauson, all the way down this rail system, and then into the Baldwin Hills, which allow us to get to the Park to Playa, which in my mind is connecting those opportunities. And it creates this potent draw for would-be explorers to the wetlands from Lenox, Hyde Park, and Westmont and Inglewood. Those are parks, transportation to parks, big idea for Metro. I'm sharing a graphic that showed Kenneth Hahn State Recreation Area is the biggest draw for these communities here in the South, all the way down to South Bay, Lawndale, and trying to get bus connections, improve bus ridership, and it's a region of interest. I'm like, this is the best thing in the world. We're working with, hopefully, MTA to get a nonprofit to apply for a grant and try and implement some of the planning that will allow for better access to our parklands. You know, the reality of that lack of transportation is the number 1 and 2 barriers to accessing public open space in the LA River region, as studied by Metro makes it important. And 22% of the parks that we do have, they don't have direct public transportation access within a quarter mile of a quality transit stop. So this shows that they're trying to get to Kenny Hahn, but once again, it's time to reach out into the ecological corners of the West and try and get to the wetlands as well. They did have a beach plan, but it really don't talk specifically about the doing experiments in that area. So I did drill down a little bit in terms of getting us to the gates or getting us to the location of the wetlands. There are currently 9 transit stops within a quarter mile. The one up here by area C, the 2 along the marina by area A, and then B is down here. B is down here by Playa del Rey. And then of course the Lincoln address has a few stops here. I think I put the zoom in of the bus on Lincoln Boulevard. That's not adequate, but it's a start. There's a lot of things that have to be done, particularly the last mile when you do get there, if the bus lines do improve. And certainly Metro is talking about the next generation of bus line plan. But when you do get there, you know, I'm more interested in the innovations that are happening with the, let's say for LA's transportation electrification partnership, which is bringing, that has a current shuttle that runs in Marina del Rey. I haven't seen it, but it is available by app. And it does take you to this little edge where the main entrance, I believe, for the wetlands area A is off of Fiji. I know parking is going to be an issue, but you know, I think LA's plan for parking is to eliminate all of it, so we don't have a car, we don't drive, and we have to take the bus, and we have to take the shuttles, and we have to take our bikes. So infrastructure, the system needs to be built, the social system needs to be fixed, that we make a priority of these things and we fill these unfulfilled mandates or these unfunded mandates with the funding necessary to get things done. And there's a bunch of bicycle plans. The LA County has, this is all the proposed routes, the dotted routes around here, and then the dark ones, you know, are MTA and proposed bike routes. Bylota Creek is the only main line into the wetlands in terms of, you know, not having to deal with traffic stops, not having to deal with others. You do have to deal with pedestrians, so you have to work that out as well. But more importantly, there are plans, and they're all disparate. You got Inglewood has its own plan, and they try and connect it with anything. You have Culver City has its own plan, and then you have the LA County plan. And I looked up 4 different. Compton has a plan. They all have plans, but the idea now is to put them together and try and do that work and build those alliances. All things said, I think I moved quicker than I thought. You know, this is about social systems trying to get us to the promised land. The show on Earth is going to be great. I mean, the wetlands are going to do their thing, and ultimately, the ecology will show us the beauty of what we lost and what we can get, and we can bring species back, and we'll probably lose some species. I mean, that is the nature of Los Angeles. But my goal is to make the nature of Los Angeles, making it equal and have opportunity for all to benefit from the jobs that come, to understand the long-term implications of planning a project like this, and to have a voice and to be at the table during the discussions. The money's not there, and the political support may or may not be there. That's all dependent on, you know, how things go in the future. But the key is right now to make sure that other people know and they can weigh in on what they like and how important it is to them and what their beneficiaries and their children will do to be a part of this final regional treasure that we have here in the West Side or the Southwest LA County. I will turn it over so we can get to the good stuff.
Well, thank you very much, David. And it really shows that you can't look at this in isolation. You know, to serve the people and really serve nature, we have to look at it as part of a huge, huge nexus and network. I want to thank, first of all, our speakers for fantastic talks and great vision, and also the fact that they did incorporate a lot of the questions that we got into their talks, directly addressing things like closed versus open systems, sea level rise, you know, endangered species, and the sorts of trade-offs we have to make. But there are some questions that we could still, that came in that we could still, I think, you know, meaningfully give to our panel to chew over and discuss. They've agreed to stay until 1:30, and I'm going to then go through some of the questions that maybe were important to a number of people and that they can comment on. And I would really like to follow up from David McNeil's talk and talk about some important issues of inclusiveness, equality, diversity. And a number of the audience members really thought back to the fact that the Tongva people were the original human inhabitants and users of this and were displaced from that landscape. And a number of people have then asked, There is concern about maybe any kind of damage that may be done to Tongva burial grounds there, or Tongva archaeological sites there. People are concerned about that. And they also want to know how the current day Gabrieliano and Tongva people might be included, or have been included, or should be included in this process. So I would like to turn that over to the panel, and if you could, just concise viewpoints on that. And I think it's a really, really important concern. So I turn it over to you.
I can start with what was included in the EIR. I know that the Department of Fish and Wildlife consulted, as they are required, on archaeological sites. And in my opinion, it's clear they went beyond state requirements. And in addition, what the state currently practices is more in depth than the original requirements, or the requirements back when we started this process. So I'm very pleased about that. And my hope is that the next phase, we're at 30% design, so we have 70% left to do. And my hope is that representatives or the community of Indigenous peoples, particularly the Tongva, will be included in that 70% design, so that they can identify, Indigenous people can identify the best way to be involved. Is there an area that can be managed by Indigenous people to grow plants for uses that are important, or to do ceremonies or education, or whatever is appropriate for the Tongva people today?
Okay, thank you. Any other panelists care to comment on that?
All I can say is the state does have a tribal liaison, and they're putting a lot of effort into trying to open the door wider for access and inclusion on this issue. And, you know, I look forward to how the next few years play out under that rubric.
Well, thank you. And let's hope that's very, very forward-looking, and let's just hope that that happens, because I think that's a really important. It's got to be just you know, a central element to what we're doing here. The other question that came up in terms of access and inclusiveness, and people were actually reflecting upon Bruce's speech, and you know, people being excluded from public lands and things like that, and so they wanted to know, you know, the gates, in a sense, there are gates that are locked, and access is still restricted to large areas of that. You know, when people get there, how, you know, what will they be able to do? How will we be able to increase access to the site and its attractiveness as a place for people of LA's diverse communities to come to?
I don't know if you could frame that question one more time.
Yeah, right now people were saying, well, a lot of the gates are closed, and you get there, you know, you can't really get on the site, you can't interact with it. How will that be different? When will the gates be more open, in a sense? And you know, what will be the things that bring the people to that site that they can actually interact with when they get down there, rather than looking at the marsh through a chain link fence?
Okay, I could answer only the part of, you know, I would like to see, you know, the opportunity for people to contribute to what they might see when they get there in the planning process, right? So, you know, can we have this greater outreach to the schools in the inner areas, into the schools, the southern areas, and say, okay, once you've gotten that bus trip and you've been in these little cooling stations trying to make your way to the wetlands, you know, what's going to be there? You know, how are you going to relate to it? Whether it's part of your curriculum, you know, et cetera, you know, whether it's an app on the phone, et cetera. So there needs to be a there, and that needs to be figured out so it's attractive. So it is going to be the greatest show on earth, but we got to get a there. In terms of where we are presently, I can't speak to the access issue. You know, I'm not a landowner, so I really don't know.
Thank you. Anyone else care to comment?
I guess I'd like to sort of follow up and say, are there plans for viewing the greatest show on earth? I mean, so many reserves have places where, for viewing nature, they're specifically set up in opportune ways so that the public can see things. How much of that is incorporated? Maybe Shelley can let us know.
Yeah, as I said, we're at 30% design. So what we know right now is that there are, I think, 6 miles of walking trails plus 3 miles of biking trails, and numerous way stations for rest areas, shade, restrooms, water. boardwalks, things like that incorporated so that people can get close to the nature that we all want to see. In an area this size, we can also leave some areas untouched. So there may be areas that are sensitive breeding habitats where we don't want people, and that's okay because the boardwalk won't go in there. So I think there are very thoughtful ways that this can be done. We have such great examples in our state already. Even just a little ways up the coast at Malibu, the bird watching area that keeps the classroom area for gathering a little bit separate from the quieter area for the actual bird watchers to sit with their binoculars, the classroom area that has the shade structures and a bench wall that also serves as a writing desk or a sketching area. So there's so many innovative things that we can do that has to come during this next 70% phase of planning. And it's a very, very high priority for the state, my understanding, and certainly for we, the advocates who want to see this restoration.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
No, I could also say managing and operating, that's a whole nother world that that someone has to take on. And yeah, I understand I'm a landowner in terms of the public owns the land. But there has to be a manager, there has to be regulations, there has to be someone who's responsible for it. And that's a difficult dance for any public agency to do. I mean, we have to close our park, we have to open our park, we have to make sure it's safe. Kenny Hahn, I mean, there's a lot of things going on at the street level that have to be dealt with.
Thank you. Another question, we dealt with a lot of the science, which was great. I think a lot of questions people had there were dealt with in your talks. I thank you for that. But one question that came up and a number of members of the audience asked about was carbon and the fact would this kind of management and changing of the landscape and the work that would need to be done, people who are concerned it's going to release more carbon that had been sequestered in the marsh. What is the net carbon impact of this development? If anyone can give us some insight on that.
I can give you some general comments on that, but I can't give you any real numbers. So in general, the carbon that's stored in the marsh soil is a lot higher than the carbon that's stored in the terrestrial soils. And so when we're talking about construction activities that will be, removing fill or taking elevations down, I don't think there's very much concern about carbon loss from the soils while that's happening, and that the conversion of those habitats into tidal wetlands will result in a net sequestration, because those tidal wetlands will sequester carbon at a much higher rate than the terrestrial soils did.
Okay, anyone else care to comment on that?
I think it will also involve management decisions that have yet to be made. For example, how much of the estuary will be eelgrass or other, different ways of managing different areas will impact this. And that's what adaptive management is for, so that we can maximize the values that are important to us as we go forward. And certainly carbon sequestration is a very important one.
Okay, I'm going to end it with one final question, and it's maybe a hard one to answer, but we're talking about this as being a model, and we're looking at the science and the engineering and the transportation to it and all serving communities, and it's very complex. But one of the things that it is sort of, one could criticize the whole process about is how divisive this is. And people have asked, why is it taking so long? Why can't a compromise be found? How long is this going to be held up in the courts before anything actually happens? And so I guess I'm just going to ask, what can we do so that we have a better process? What can we do to move this ahead in a more agreeable manner?
Compromise is the number one word, right? I mean, it's all about compromise and finding some middle ground that people can accept. We all get in our corners and have holy wars over our passions. And, and I get it. You want to hear me talk about equity and access and racial justice, I'll talk forever. But there are other things that need to be figured out, that there's common ground. And there's always common ground in terms of the greatest show on earth. I mean, there's always common ground in terms of providing access to everyone. It's the great equalizer. It's the bridge. I mean, every park that I've ever worked in, any open public spaces become the bridge. But I think you kind of you burn the bridge sometimes because of these passions and these points of view. And it has a lot of myopic, focus to it, as opposed to stepping back and seeing the bigger picture. So it's never fun, I suppose, to look, to back away from your corner, but compromise is the only way I see. I don't have any other answers.
Anyone else care to comment?
I could make one comment. One of the things is that obviously this restoration is designed around a parcel of land that has discrete boundaries that are, ownership dictated. And one of the major problems is the notion that there are all these different functions that government and bureaucracies have. And it's really hard to have a regional synthetic solution when everybody does such a good job of staying in their lane. So I think that we need a broader societal interaction to solve the transportation integrated problems with these restoration problems. So, we're not solving just one thing at a time.
Thank you. Anyone else care to comment? Well, okay. I think that I thank you for spending the extra time with us. I thank the audience for spending the extra time with us. This is the first of one of these URSUS symposia, and we will attempt to look at issues which are important in Southern California. And I think it was a great start. So let's give a virtual round of applause to our panelists, and thank you all for being part of this historical first URSUS Environmental Symposium from the Department of Geography at UCLA. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Go URSUS.